Perhaps the best known abduction of all, and one of the earliest reported, is the abduction of a well-respected New England couple, Betty and Barney Hill. Barney Hill died in February of 1969, 8 years after their UFO experience on September 20th, 1961. Their experience has been described in a book, The Interrupted Journey, and a movie, The UFO Incident.
So what happened is that suddenly Betty and Barney found themselves on a new road. This is after that series of buzzing sounds striking the trunk of the car. And there were tall trees all around. They saw a red light glowing in the distance, and then they saw entities standing in the road. They were confused. Is this a roadblock? Are we being robbed? Is there an accident ahead? And then when those entities started to approach the car, Barney said to Betty, "It's the ones I saw in the field." She became terrified. She tried to open her car door and run into the woods, but she was intercepted, and Barney was taken from the car. He felt as if he was floating, and he recalled that only the toes of his shoes were bumping along the rocks. And then he felt his feet slide up a ramp and bump at the top of this ramp, and he was taken into a room and put on a table. Betty regained consciousness, and she was standing at the bottom of this ramp, and she decided to fight for her life. She struggled and she kicked one. And when she did, she tore the lining of her dress from waist to hemline, and the hem was torn down. Barney's shoes, as you will remember, had to be replaced. They were so deeply scuffed. So then she was put under control again, and she was taken up the ramp and into an examining room separate from Barney's. She was at first placed on what was sort of like a dentist chair. And they examined both Betty and Barney very much in the same way. So I'll tell you what happened to both of them here. Their skin was examined. Their fingernails were clipped, hair samples were taken, samples were taken from their ears, from their noses, from their mouths. Their joints were examined, their hands and their fingers, their feet and their toes were very closely examined. Their joints were moved. So they appeared to have a great deal of interest in the human skeletal system, also in the human nervous system. Barney felt what he described as feeling like a finger counting the vertebrae in his back. Betty interpreted that as a stylus that was moving down her back, recording any information that they could acquire about her nervous system. The examinations departed when Betty was taken off the chair, placed on the examining table. At this point, her dress was removed, breaking the zipper and tearing the fabric at the top of the zipper. And she is placed on this table, and the examiner produces a very large needle. She says, "What are you going to do with that?" And he telepathically says to her, it's only a simple test. The only way I can describe it is like a pregnancy test. It won't hurt. Don't worry. We're just going to insert it into your navel. And she said, "It will hurt. Don't do it." But he plunged it into her navel anyway, causing great pain, which fortunately the leader who was standing up by her head removed as soon as she experienced it. She was very grateful to him for this. We now know that ova is extracted from women as part of the Greys program. And this appears to have been sort of a race of Greys. They weren't the ones with the great big heads and the little tiny spindly bodies. In fact, Betty and Barney said that the taller ones, who were about 5 feet tall, had heads that were larger in proportion to human bodies, but not huge. They had large chests. Their arms and legs were fairly spindly. They walked with a different kind of gait than we do. They were completely hairless, larger eyes than we have, very small noses, a slit for a mouth, no lips, no external ears like we have. To go back to now Barney's exam, they took a sperm sample from Barney, which was never made public because it was so embarrassing, and was never made public until years after his death. But Bud Hopkins, who was a renowned UFO and abduction researcher, had this told to him time and time again by men who he had placed in hypnosis, even though he did not know at the time about Barney's experience. And, it's all part of the program that this race of non-humans has for us humans. And this came much, much later in my research, where I had the opportunity to work on 3 studies on nearly 5,000 experiencers in all. The messages that they have been given time and time again is that they are very concerned about our survival.
The beings that had been on the craft were now standing in the middle of the road, a dirt road, blocking our way. The car motor stalled. They separated, came up on each side, took us out of the car, and at that point, I realized that they undoubtedly planned to take us on board. And that even increased my fears. So that actually, by the time we had arrived at the craft, I was fighting. I was in a panic. They just held me. I was taken into the first room, Barney into the second room, where we were given, as the leader, as I call him, gave us testing. There were 11 beings, and for purposes of identification, I called one the leader, because he seemed to be in charge of the project of doing this testing, and he was the only one who spoke English. Then there was the examiner who did the testing, and then there were 9 others we called crew members. They stayed outside the room in the corridor. Our examinations were very much similar in that with both Barney and I, they checked our eyes, ears, nose, throat, took samples of our hair, fingernail, and they scraped our skin. With me, they touched my body with little points on wires. He said he was checking my nervous system. And then they attempted to insert a needle-like instrument in my navel. I objected that it would hurt, and he said it shouldn't hurt. When he did this, it caused a great deal of pain. He said it was a pregnancy test, and I said, well, that's no pregnancy test here.
Betty Hill was right. In 1961, there was no pregnancy test like that here on Earth. But in the early 1970s, 2 techniques, amniocentesis and laparoscopy, have both come into wide usage. Both are techniques that provide information about pregnancy and bear a striking resemblance to the experience that Betty Hill described. It's difficult to imagine Betty Hill inventing medical techniques that did not yet exist on Earth unless her UFO experience actually occurred. When the alien leader saw the pain that Betty was experiencing, he put his hand on her head, and the pain went away.
We left the craft and went back to the car, and we stood there by the car, and we watched the craft leave. We saw it become surrounded by a fiery, revolving mass of some kind. We could see the UFO in the middle of this. and it lifted up, dipped down, went right straight up, and was gone. I received a copy of the radar report from Pease Air Force Base, where they had tracked an unidentified craft at 2:14 a.m. Just about the time we estimate that the UFO left. We went back and we found the spot where we were captured. It was not a fantasy. It was a real experience. And I believe that I have enough evidence to establish that.
I first met Betty and Barney Hill in November 1968. I've spent a great deal of time since then investigating their abduction. I've talked to Dr. Benjamin Simon about his hypnosis sessions. I've listened to the tapes of those sessions, and I've looked at Marjorie Fish's star map work in great depth. It seems clear to me that Betty and Barney Hill were taken on board a flying saucer in New Hampshire in 1961. Their story must be taken at face value. It's true.
I think for a long, long time I had the feeling that I had sort of lived through a tragedy in some way. Because it's something that's haunting. It's something that's always on my mind, no matter where I go or what I do. Because I do lead a very active life and I have many, many interests, but always that's on the back of my mind. It's the last thing I think of when I go to bed at night, and it's the first thing I think of in the morning when I wake up. And I expect it'll probably be that way for the rest of my life.